Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad, and I'm joined by my co-host Noura Erakat, and we are very lucky to be conversing with a very unique guest today, Omar Barghouti. I will share a bit about his bio, but first, let me ask you, Omar, how are you? كيفك?
Thank you.
This is the eighth session of In Defense of Academic Freedom under the title The Frontlines of Educator Resistance. We started with the In Defense of Academic Freedom series, addressing the assault on academic freedom as it intensifies in the United States and beyond on various campuses. Specifically, the original series takes note of cases of defamation, intimidation, and suspension that faculty are being subjected to in the U.S. and beyond. We aimed to raise awareness regarding the conditions and pretenses under which such violations occur. In this eighth session, and in the new subtitle of The Front Lines of Educator Resistance, the series invites academics, activists, and educators to discuss how we organize workers across positions in higher education, as well as K through 12, in advance of the school year to push back against the repression at our institutions. Just like we are preparing for the new semester, we are confident that people on the other side are preparing the new methods and mechanisms of repression. We discuss a variety of tactics, including leveraging internal processes with the support of unions, legal avenues, public pressure campaigns, and boycotts. And no one is more equipped to address these topics, especially the latter ones, as Omar is. I'll share a brief bio. You can read the full bio on Jadaliya. And this is, of course, a part of the larger Gaza and Context project, and also supported by a number of institutions that are listed on the announcement. Omar Barghouti is a co-founder of the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, BDS, for Palestinian rights, and the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACBI. He is a recipient of the 2017 Gandhi Peace Award. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering from Columbia University in New York, and is currently pursuing a PhD in philosophy of ethics at the University of Amsterdam, which, of course, for me is a major passion. So I really appreciate that, Omar, and I'd love to speak with you off camera about this. Here, he is the author of BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, from Haymarket in 2011, and his commentaries and interviews have appeared in many media outlets, including The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Financial Times, among others. Before we move forward, I'd like to ask Omar to start by addressing this moment, the current moment, which is probably larger than anything we have witnessed in many decades. And within that context, if you can address the history of BDS and your work with PACBI and what you see fit as an introduction to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Bassam, Noura. Yes, I would like to contextualize the work we do in BDS in the current moment, which is a unique moment. 20 years ago, we were told it's impossible for a movement for Palestinian rights calling for boycotts, divestment, and targeted sanctions on Israel's regime of oppression to take off. As a statement by the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the largest Palestinian coalition leading the global BDS movement, has said, July 9th, 2005, that's the BDS call date, will be remembered in history as the start of a principled, strategic, and creative process that has isolated Israel's decades-old regime of settler colonialism, apartheid, and military occupation at the grassroots and institutional level. End of quote. Oppressors and their propagandists always tell us it's impossible to aspire for freedom, justice, equality. Yet with people power, with our collective, principled, creative, and strategic work and agency, we make the impossible possible. Do no harm has become a fundamental ethical principle of global solidarity led by the BDS movement. In this most depraved phase of the US-Israeli live-stream genocide against 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, or what Jewish Voice for Peace calls Israel's quote-unquote final solution, we mark the BDS movement's 20th anniversary to affirm the power of our movement in isolating Israel's 77-year-old regime of oppression. enabled and emboldened by the boundless complicity of fascist and authoritarian forces in the US and elsewhere in the colonial West, Israel is trying to numb our consciences with its relentless savagery, to exterminate the survivors of its ongoing Nakba, not gradually, as it has been doing for decades, but in one fell swoop. Eliminating the natives, after all, is a feature, not a bug, in settler colonial history, as Native Americans know all too well. In this darkest of moments, BDS helps to decolonize our minds from the powerlessness and hopelessness with which Israel and its colonial partners have relentlessly attempted to colonize them. In 2005, BDS was launched by the broadest Palestinian coalition, giving rise to this worldwide anti-racist, nonviolent solidarity movement that nuclear-powered Israel fears as an existential threat to its regime. It was preceded by the 2004 call for the academic and cultural boycott, and that was no coincidence, because the role of academic and cultural institutions in Israel's regime of oppression is extremely critical. Despite Israel's well-oiled propaganda, lawfare, and deep influence on corrupt politicians and on genocidal corporations and media outlets, BDS has had an irrefutable impact, even in this moment. For instance, universities worldwide, particularly in Europe, North America, Latin America, and Africa, have cut academic and/or financial ties with Israel and its complicit institutions. Israel has drastically lost much of its dominance in Horizon, the world's largest research program of the European Union. Scholarly associations, including the American Anthropological Association, Middle East Studies Association, Latin American Council of Social Sciences, American Studies Association, among many others, have all endorsed the boycott of complicit Israeli institutions. Most recently, the International Sociological Association suspended the complicit Israeli Sociological Society. But other than academia, in the economic sphere, in the cultural sphere, in so many spheres, the BDS impact has been irrefutable. Norway's sovereign fund, the world's largest, as well as major US churches, have divested from Israel bonds. Over 7,000 writers and publishers have endorsed the cultural boycott of Israel. Governments in the global south, including Colombia, have enacted trade sanctions and military or energy embargoes. BDS has actually played a key role in Intel's decision to scrap a $25 billion investment in Israel and to accelerate Israel's descent into what we call a shutdown nation. In fact, the chairman of the Israel Export Institute has admitted that BDS has, quote, changed Israel's global trade landscape, end of quote. With a massive global network supported by trade unions, farmers' coalitions, racial, social, gender, and climate justice movements, together representing tens of millions, the BDS movement has radically transformed the very ethics of solidarity, setting as its most profound prerequisite the obligation to end complicity, to do no harm. As early as 1923, Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote with lucid honesty, quote, every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. He went on, Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. End of quote. So aside from its concrete and high-tech walls surrounding Palestinian ghettos, especially Gaza, Israel has incessantly tried to construct an iron wall in our minds by trying to reduce us to human animals, to isolate us from our natural Arab environment and the rest of the world, and to sear into our consciousness, through sustained unspeakable violence, the imperative of submission to its indomitable power as fate. So BDS is a response to this. It's a hopeful, formidable antidote to this induced hopelessness. It's a beacon of resistance, resilience, and regeneration in that sense. So BDS is inspired by a century of Palestinian popular resistance, initially against British colonialism and then Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. It's inspired by liberation movements, especially the South African anti-apartheid movement, and of course justice movements like the civil rights movement in the US. At a minimum, BDS has decided, in order for Palestinians to exercise our inalienable right to self-determination as an indigenous people in our homeland, three basic rights must be achieved: an end to military occupation, an end to the system of racial domination, segregation, and apartheid, and most importantly, the right of refugees to return and receive reparations, refugees being the largest constituency among Palestinians. BDS is opposed to all forms of racism: anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism, among others. It's based on international law, but it takes a very critical view of this law and strives to expand its interpretation beyond the confines initially set by its colonial founders. Angela Davis has recently said, "Palestine is really the center of the world today." When activists around the world chant in their millions, "Palestine frees us all," they're reflecting on a sense of empowering defiance, of speaking truth to political and corporate power, or what we call strategic radicalism, that the Palestine Solidarity Movement and BDS at its core has inspired among diverse justice movements worldwide, just as the South African anti-apartheid movement had done in the 1980s, and I was personally active in that movement then. An entire young generation today across the world accurately perceives of Gaza as not just a scene of destruction of tens of thousands of Palestinian lives and of a 4,000-year-old civilization with unparalleled brutality and impunity at the hands of a US-Israeli genocidal axis, but also, simultaneously, they see it as emblematic of a dystopian era of might makes right, that poses a threat to humanity at large, as fatal as the climate calamity. So do no harm is the ABCs of solidarity, as the BDS movement, including PACBI, has consistently advocated. We've therefore called for pressure on institutions of higher education to do no harm by, one, respecting the comprehensive rights of the Palestinian people under international law, and I mean the entire Palestinian people, not just those conveniently recognized as such in the West Bank and Gaza. Two, end complicity in Israel's atrocity crimes by cutting academic ties with complicit Israeli universities and cutting financial ties with and investments in complicit companies. To end, in his iconic book, Black Skin, White Masks, Frantz Fanon writes, quote, "If the question of practical solidarity with a given past ever arose for me, it did so only to the extent to which I was committed to myself and to my neighbor to fight for all my life and with all my strength so that never again would a people on earth be subjugated," end of quote. To fight subjugation, especially when one's state or institution is implicated in it, as is the case in the US, the most profound ethical obligation is to end complicity, to do no harm. Nothing else matters as much, especially now in the time of genocide and induced starvation. The path is still long and treacherous, but with our collective undeterred will, our strategic radicalism, we can and shall prevail.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you for setting up that context for us, for walking us back historically to a moment when, in the launch of BDS, in our case at Berkeley, the launch from divesting from apartheid Israel in 2001 was ridiculed as a fancy of the left who don't understand real politics, where now it has become so much of a threat precisely because of popular mobilization that not only is it deemed as the second most significant threat to Israel, according to Netanyahu, after a nuclear capable Iran, but also has mobilized some 35 states in the United States alone to enact laws to criminalize it. In fact, the Trump administration just this week has announced that any municipality that supports divestment will not receive emergency funding. And there's a lot to unpack there, right? There's a lot to unpack about what the Trump administration is doing in order to ensure compliance, and what one might describe as these fascistic tendencies, with and couching that in the protection of Israel, and how much is lost in between. We want to get to all of it. Let me start by highlighting, this idea that you share with us in this moment, that BDS is an antidote to hopelessness, is so key, precisely because we're some 669 days onwards, at a point where starvation is undeniable of the population across the besieged territory. And Netanyahu has just announced that he's going to conquer Gaza almost with, in a way that everyone is normalized. Yet we have been, a lot of folks around us, including ourselves at many junctures, feel hopelessness. And so this idea that BDS is that anecdote because we become agents of change when we're able to identify where are we locally and what we can do, is just so key. So I'd love to just start kind of at the surface level of BDS in this moment, and tactics, and the ways that it's been leveraged tactically, as opposed to BDS historically in the way that it's been leveraged. Are you able to see a shift in those tactics that's been able to very much target this moment, even in times, as we've seen across university campuses, where divestment wasn't achieved, but just based on the demand, something, the needle was being moved forward, even without divesting holdings. Sometimes that just the demand and the nature of it is able to take us a step forward. Can you comment? Do you see a shift in these kind of tactical interventions, and if so, how?
Well, first, I think little Gaza, has exposed the fault lines of so-called liberal democracy in the West, including universities, especially universities. It has shown not just academics, but so many students, that they're taken for granted academic freedom and liberalism, and the pursuit of the truth in their universities amounts to very little when it conflicts with the agendas of the powers that be, the establishment, basically. When push came to shove, the administrations of major liberal universities in the West have shown themselves to be authoritarian, dictators, repressive, anti-democratic. They brought in police shooting rubber bullets at UCLA, dogs in Swedish universities, bulldozers in Dutch universities, bulldozing peaceful encampments, and so on and so forth. So I think many young people today realize that they've been living kind of a false illusion of this democracy, and Gaza has exposed this. So when activists on campuses have called for boycotts and divestment, more boycotts in Europe, more divestment in the United States, they were met with unbelievable repression and violence, which goes well beyond the demands for, divestment, and you can just ignore the demands of the students and the academics and continue business as usual. And you continue to be complicit. Why on earth would universities and governments feel the need to go in with full force to suppress this before it is uncontainable, before it becomes too contagious? Because they feel that it will expose a lot more than complicity in Israel's genocide and crimes. It will expose the very faults, the very inherent systematic faults of this system. So I think in terms of shift of tactics, yes, absolutely. Nothing has prepared us for the genocide. With decades of experience, but nothing has prepared us for the genocide. But we saw that we needed to escalate like never before. And what used to be very difficult to push for, like a full academic boycott from Israel, became acceptable in much wider circles. So clearly we had to shift tactics. Things like calling for a strike, with one of the demands being academic boycott of Israel, was unimaginable months ago. In end of 2024, the University of Amsterdam trade union representing staff, something to be envied in the US, I know, academics are not unionized, but in Europe they are. They did manage a strike for 4 days, calling for academic boycott of Israel and divestment, full divestment. So we're seeing things that have been just imagined years ago, a few years ago. So indeed, we've shifted tactics in terms of seeing that we can achieve a lot more despite the massive repression, and maybe we can talk more about that. So we're no longer as cautious as we used to be in pushing certain demands. We're very, very assertive, as we've always been, about Palestinian rights, the 3 rights. We cannot compromise on that, but we're much more assertive about the tactics and the demands of this moment.
So this is a good place to ask you about this, precisely because of the threat that popular mobilization poses. I mean, for the first time ever, for example, in the United States, a majority of Americans across both, both sides of the aisle are more favorable to Palestinians than they are to Israel. In some 6 Western European countries, that becomes even more stark, where you have, over 60 to 75% of those polled who are more sympathetic to Palestine. And it was precisely because of that, as you're noting, that there has been repression not only from federal governments, right, but from the universities themselves, who have, exposed themselves as arms of the state and arms of state violence, as opposed to another mythology that we've veneer that we've held on to, which is that these are independent ivory towers, which are sites of independent thought and academic freedom. And that's reached its apex for those of us in the United States, where now there's punishment associated with it, specifically to the universities. Right now we've seen Harvard and Columbia capitulate full on in a way where they've literally taken on this in service of the U.S. empire, and in this moment, the Trump administration, to punish its faculty and its students for doing exactly what they're supposed to do, what they're encouraged to do. How do you think that alters the challenge of academic boycott campaigns when now the cost of it and the risk of it becomes so much higher, right? Where we've seen outright, for example, we've seen a journal of education that was fully edited, peer-reviewed, ready for publication. It was in press that the editorial board was forced to pull. How do you think that also changes the nature of how academic boycott campaigns, forget, you can't predict how they will be waged, but maybe how should they be waged in light of that?
Well, as most Arabs would know, there's a song by Fairuz, the great Lebanese singer, that says something like, if it doesn't get bigger, it won't get smaller. When a crisis becomes so blatant, so in your face, that's when there's a possibility, there's potential, if we exercise our agency, to resist it much better. Because that's an educational moment, as this moment is. Today, it's not just the left and the most progressive parts of US society that are saying that Israel has too much influence in this government, in Congress as well as the White House. It's today even the right wing, the MAGA pundits are openly saying this is an Israelization of US policy. This is not America first, this is Israel first. So things that some on the left, most radical left used to say today is shared by very mainstream figures. Today, some very respected economists like Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University is saying that Netanyahu calls the shots in the White House. And he's not a conspiracy theorist. Obviously, he knows what he's talking about, not to mention Mearsheimer and many, many others, and the right wing, the far right and the MAGA groups. So today, there's this awakening that is unprecedented. As you know, Noura and Bassam, as I know, having lived in the US for so long, been an activist in the US for so long, we've never seen anything like this in the mainstream discourse about Israel. So this massive repression can beget massive resistance. It's not inevitable. It's not something that's divine that will fall from the sky. It's our agency always. It's our ability to mobilize, to build, to galvanize people power ultimately. But now we have a unique opportunity to do so, because every student and every academic at Harvard and Columbia and Yale and Stanford and Berkeley and everywhere can see that their administrations, their states, their bureaucrats, their elected officials are not acting in the interest of the United States, at least the 99%, the working people in the United States. They're acting on behalf of a foreign government because of an extremely corrupt system and the power of lobbies, not just the Zionist lobby, Christian and Jewish Zionist lobbies, but also the corporate lobbies, the oligarchs of the tech industry, the military industry with its massive influence in the White House and Congress. So those politicians are bought and paid for by the lobbies, as even Thomas Friedman of the genocidal New York Times has once said, long ago said that our elected officials are bought and paid for by the lobby. This has become a truth that is hard to refute today. So this gives us an opportunity. If we manage to use this to build even bigger, more powerful intersectional coalitions that connect struggles and push for the right tactics, I think we can galvanize a much stronger resistance. What I mean by tactics, and I don't want to get into too many details now, but just very, very quickly, instead of at a university like Harvard, where it's impossible to consider today to have a policy against Israel, can we not push a policy for what we call ethical academic ties, which says this institution shall not engage in academic relations with universities that are knowingly, persistently involved, implicated, complicit in atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. Period. No mention of Palestine, no mention of Israel, no mention of any specific geography. This would serve the interests of the climate justice groups and the Black justice and the indigenous and the women's rights group, and everyone that is progressive will benefit from such a policy being passed, because it targets every complicit institution that is persistently complicit. And this can allow us later to say, well, if you've adopted this policy, then exclude Tel Aviv University and Hebrew University and Ben Gurion University and so on, because they're exactly what you say. They're implicated on the record in atrocity crimes. So we need to think out of the box and sometimes step back with our Palestine agenda and see what intersectional agenda can be an actual foundational step forward that we can build on. And I think this moment allows for such out-of-the-box creative tactics. Building intersectional coalitions is not a luxury. It's an absolute necessity for survival for justice movements today.
Omar, can we? I'm not as I don't enunciate as well as Noura does, so I have to bring the microphone closer. Can we address, or can you address actually, in practical terms, the way PACBI works with individuals and institutions to implement boycotts, and you can expand and address any of the aspects involved in this, and who do you think at this moment, considering some of the things you said and some of the reality, parts of the reality we are observing, where um, the unusual suspects, basically, or people that we did not expect would be pushing for their own reasons, not for humanitarian reasons, dealing with the questions of self-determinations of Palestinians, but for other reasons, they're actually, we found ourselves with them in the same camp. In general, can you address who are or can be our organizational allies in the struggle at this moment and going forward?
Sure. Well, on the first part, Bassam, in all PACBI's history, which is 21 years now, we faced in the so-called liberal West the question of academic freedom. Wouldn't this suppress the academic freedom of Israeli academics? Well, today, if I'm asked this question in a Western university, I immediately say this is a racist, dehumanizing question. At a time when Israel is committing scholasticide within its genocide, at a time when it has destroyed all Palestinian universities and killed thousands upon thousands of academic scholars, researchers, and tens of thousands of students, what are you talking about? About the hypothetical potential of PACBI, of academic boycott of Israel, possibly infringing on the superhumans' right to academic freedom? Are we subhumans and all you're concerned about are the superhumans? I mean, this kind of colonial 19th century mentality is still live and kicking today. But let's discuss the details. Since its inception, PACBI has called for institutional boycotts. Unlike the South African boycott, I was active in the South African anti-apartheid movement at Columbia University, and then we boycotted everyone and everything South African. It was a blanket boycott. The Palestinian BDS movement has never called for a blanket boycott. It has always called for targeted boycotts against complicit institutions. It targets complicity, not identity. It targets institutions, not individuals. Unless, of course, those individuals are implicated in committing crimes or inciting to war crimes and international crimes. Then there's something that we can deal with them as potential criminals. But the issue of academic freedom has shifted tremendously with Israel's live-streamed genocide. But even before then, as far back as 2013, Joan Scott, a leading defender of academic freedom in the US, as you know, wrote in the Journal of Academic Freedom, published by the AAUP, quote, "It is because we believe so strongly in principles of academic freedom that a strategic boycott of the state that so abuses it makes sense right now." In making a U-turn on her position on PACBI, she said that. The AAUP's recent statement from months ago, which reversed its prior opposition to academic boycotts, also clearly stated that boycotts, quote, "can be considered legitimate tactical responses to conditions that are fundamentally incompatible with the mission of higher education." This confirms that there are instances in which upholding academic freedom may actually mean withholding intellectual labor. So this has become a kind of a moot issue to debate whether academic boycotts of Israel would lead to some infringement of academic freedom. Now, on the second part, what would our potential allies look like? I think we need to distinguish between principled partners and allies who share with us progressive values, the values of justice for all, freedom for all, equality for all, that international law has to apply consistently to everyone, and those who are conveniently today, after 22 months of genocide, want to whitewash their past complicity in enabling the genocide by saying, oh, we need to stop the war in Gaza. We need to stop the starvation, because the starvation is making some Israeli historians compare it to Nazi tactics. Today, very prominent Israel Prize winners who are Zionist, deeply Zionist, and some who are not Zionist, are comparing what Israel is doing in Gaza, its plans for concentration camps, and its induced starvation of 2+ million Palestinians, to Auschwitz, to the Warsaw Ghetto. They're making the comparison. This is now out in the open by Israelis, in the mainstream Israeli media, in academic discussions, on TV, and so on. This opens the possibility of broader coalitions, yes, but we're always very, very cautious about the motives of those people. They want to whitewash their own past of enabling the genocide. For 21 months, they've supported the genocide implicitly or explicitly. They've tried to whitewash the genocide. They tried to both sides the genocide, and now they want to the red carpet treatment that they've lost in Western universities. They're no longer invited. They're no longer wanted. And now they want to go back to being invited everywhere and appearing in conferences as the prophets of peace. So they think. So now they're trying to say, oh, we don't like this war. Starving people is not a nice idea, in fact, but in still extremely dehumanizing language. So they're not partners. They're not allies. But their shift may help inadvertently our agenda in pushing for dismantling the system of oppression that has launched the genocide. The genocide is not happening on its own. It's a growth of 77 years of an ongoing Nakba. It is the ultimate phase of the Nakba, but it's a continuum. And we need to address the root causes: settler colonialism, apartheid, not just genocide, and the day after, and what will happen to Gaza after. Gaza has been totally destroyed. What will happen after is a factor of what happened for 77 years. We cannot ignore that. We cannot go back to the rigged, destructive, and hopelessly corrupt mentality of Oslo.
That's, the last point that you make, Omar, especially in this moment where there is a lot of to do around the G7 states wanting to recognize Palestine, right? And, it's like this feeling of this is far too little, much too late. And so much of it, what it reveals is that what they're really concerned with is less mobilizing for Palestinian rights, which would look like arms embargo, trade sanctions, unseating from the UN, and instead, what it actually reveals is they're trying to contain the question, the horizon of Palestinian freedom by limiting what that horizon looks like, who could govern and where. And so that folds into the discussion that you were just raising around how we talk about Palestine. When we understand Gaza as the cruelest phase of an ongoing genocide, it makes it clear that only a comprehensive, campaign that addresses the root cause is adequate. And yet we see very much that in the face of this reckoning with Nakba and with Zionism, that there's also this this pushback to contain it, to contain the question and to contain the height of Palestinian liberation and to contain the horizon of what activists can do. And so here I feel that we might actually see a lot more actors on their own, right, appear to want to step in, but to limit their advocacy to divestment and boycott in the West Bank, to sanction settlers, to target settlement goods, precisely in the moment when everything has now come into scrutiny. Have you seen that trend? Do you think that this is something that we should, should be prepared to see more of in the time to come, specifically because of the way that this has developed, where, as much as these G7 states are trying to save Israel from itself, they can't?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a very clear attempt to completely divert attention from the genocide and the root causes of genocide by micro-focusing on things that have absolutely no impact on weakening this system of oppression. So when the UK and France talk about sanctions against settlers, that they're doing it for show, because UN experts, dozens of UN human rights experts, after the ICJ in July 2024, ruled that Israel's entire occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem at the very least, is illegal and amounts to apartheid. Dozens of UN human rights experts said this makes it an absolute obligation for states to, quote, cancel or suspend economic relationships, trade agreements, and academic relations with Israel that may contribute to its unlawful presence and apartheid regime in the occupied Palestinian territory. And this includes also imposing a full arms embargo on Israel, halting all arms agreements, imports, exports, transfers, and dual use, and so on and so forth. So those states, while continuing to arm and otherwise enable Israel's genocide and ongoing settler colonial apartheid, They want to show their populations that, as you mentioned, recent polls have shown, massive majorities are opposed to Israel's genocide and support Palestinian rights. So they want to appease their publics by doing the least possible and present it so deceptively as doing something about sanctions. Those are not sanctions. Those are absolutely nonsensical measures to whitewash those criminal governments' complicity and partnership in genocide. And they're partners in genocide. They're not just complicit, they're actual partners, especially the US government, but also the British government, the German government, the Dutch government, and others, while continuing to arm Israel, to enable it, and to defend it and shield it from accountability in international law. They are destroying the very pillars of international law. They're ignoring the ICJ and the ICC. They're undermining the pillars of a system that they had built after World War II. The West, the colonial West itself, was the most invested in this system of international law that today they are sacrificing for the sake of saving their favorite settler colony from demise. It is just so ironic what's happening since 1945 till today. That who would have thought that protecting Israel as a settler colony would be the factor that has led ultimately to the demise of international law, as is happening before our eyes. So indeed, as you said absolutely correctly, in my view, those states are trying to evade their legal obligations. We're not asking them for charity. We're not asking them to go out of their way to help Palestinians. Just stop destroying our lives with your weapons and your finances and your political and diplomatic and academic and cultural complicity in Israel's crimes.
Thanks, Omar. I want to bring us back a little bit to your actual work in Palestine with PACBI and PDS. If you can talk a little bit more on how does this look like today in the context of genocide, and perhaps talk about potential bridges at this moment, or connections that can be made or that can develop. I know that from knowing you for a very long time, that these connections already exist, and they're pretty profound and robust. But at this point, is there anything that could bring added value to these existing connections, or creating new connections based on your actual work inside Palestine? And feel free again to take this in any direction.
Yes, well, one thing about inside and outside this dichotomy has been largely erased, Bassam. In the BDS movement, we see this organic, very close intertwinement between our struggle inside with our struggle outside. And that's why we've called it a globalized intifada from day one. And for those ignorant US politicians that have completely misunderstood, misconstrued, misrepresented intifada, it just means uprising. Look it up, idiots. It just means uprising. So we've always said that BDS is presenting a globalized intifada in a sense that connects our popular struggle against settler colonialism, apartheid, and military occupation inside with international solidarity, because we alone cannot defeat this settler colonial system. It's impossible, because it's not a state that we're fighting against. It's not this regime only that we're fighting against. It's part of a global system of oppression that Israel is just the front of, basically. So we're fighting imperialism, we're fighting tech companies and military companies and financial corporations and academic institutions and cultural institutions. It is so broad, which we have not faced in the South African struggle. It was much smaller scale. Yes, the South African government, apartheid government, was supported by corporations and banks and Thatcher and Reagan and so on, but not to this extent. They wouldn't have sacrificed everything to save apartheid, and they actually didn't ultimately. They let apartheid go under the bus, at least political apartheid, not economic apartheid, when they saw it as convenient for them to do so, and when their publics pressured them so much to do so. With Israel, they're going to the end with it. They will sacrifice the entire system that they've created, as we said, international law and so on, to save this settler colony. So inside, BDS is organizing actually much better than before on campuses. There are BDS clubs on so many campuses. I'm talking about the West Bank specifically, obviously. Within 1948, communities, Palestinians who are the citizens of present-day Israel, it has gone underground, BDS activism. Although in 2010, 2012, 14, 15, it used to be thriving. We had a conference in Nazareth, BDS conference in Nazareth, actually 2017 or 16. Today, it has gone underground because of the repression. Israel's repression against any form of Palestinian nationalism, activism for Palestinian rights, and so on, has increased like never before. I've been in the country since 1993 when I returned, and I've never seen the level of repression that we're seeing today. People are getting imprisoned and interrogated for putting a like on some banal post on Facebook. This has never happened before to this extent, really, at least not since the 1960s. So it has become much more difficult in 48. Palestinian communities in exile are becoming much more active than before, especially in Western countries, in Latin American countries, and so on. Palestinian communities are being mobilized like never before. And despite some ultra unstrategic tendencies that are small but extremely loud, I think the majority are gravitating towards more strategic work. They understand the principles. They understand that they need, more than anything else, not to sloganeer, but to do real work to end complicity in the countries where they're active. When Palestinians in Chile, for example, want to stand with the Palestinian struggle for liberation, there's one most effective way to do that: end Chilean complicity in Israel's crimes. Corporate complicity, academic complicity, and so on and so forth. Similarly in the US, similarly in the UK, and so on. So the inside-outside dichotomy has largely been not erased, but has become much less clear today with the genocide, as we're more and more connecting the struggle within with the struggle without to end this system of oppression, connecting complicity, international complicity, state, corporate, institutional complicity, directly with the struggle for liberation.
Do you want to?
Yeah, you set me up for two questions, Ahmad. So I'm just gonna share them with you, and please answer them, or one or both as you please. So the first question relates to what you were sharing with us earlier, which is and ties to this idea that since 1993 the repression has never been so strong. That in fact Israel, at least historically, has been a democracy for Jews only, and yet today even that can no longer be said. And what is that? What does that tell us? And what does that portend for a particular internal chasm and combustion that might be, on the horizon within Israel itself as a result of that? The other one is around, where does this fit in the region? I mean, we talk often about BDS on American and European campuses, but we've also been in this moment, it's been very clear. What's also been illuminated is the complicity of Arab regimes. When, Egypt refuses to open up the Rafah, crossing, when it blocks a solidarity march to go through Rafah to break the siege, when Jordan is attacking its own activists and using its firepower to protect Israel from Iran, when obviously before we even get to the UAE, and its role in its role in genocide in Sudan, which is to say nothing of the way that it has been complicit in, entrenching normalization with Israel. Here it brings up for us also the role of BDS in the region, right? In the region. What has been, what is the status of that and the potential of that to grow even more at this moment? So I know I'm setting up two very different questions. Maybe you can touch on where you're at and then expand, or choose one of them.
Well, I'll address both, but just briefly because they're very broad questions and very, very important questions. Let me start with the Arab region question, and then I'll address the potential for implosion that more Israeli critics and analysts are bringing up in the mainstream, in the Israeli mainstream. As far as the Arab region is concerned, this is the darkest moment I've ever seen in my 43 years of activism in the Arab region in terms of Arab officialdom completely and totally betraying the Palestinian cause. And it does not reflect what Western liberal analysts like to present as Arabs are forgetting about Palestine because they're worried about their own price of bread and democracy. That is absolute nonsense. Poll after poll have shown that Palestine remains the core cause of people in the Arab region. And in the BDS movement, by the way, we use Arab not in an ethnic sense, in a more kind of democratic sense that's inclusive of ethnic minorities, Armenians, Amazighs, Kurds, and other, all the many rich diversity of groups that make up this Arab region. So in the Arab region, while officialdom has completely sold out, especially the UAE and several Gulf states and other states, at the grassroots level, we still see a very strong support for Palestine, but very repressed, extremely repressed. Even in countries like Kuwait, where there used to be a thriving a movement for Palestinian rights and even a thriving BDS group in Kuwait. Today, the repression is unprecedented. Not to mention Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. I mean, the repression there has always been massive. But despite that, and as a rule, BDS thrives in more relatively democratic states and does not do very well in dictatorships. But in the Arab region, we have no choice but to organize despite authoritarianism, dictatorships, and full betrayal of Palestine. And just to give anecdotal examples of the impact, in Morocco, just a couple of days ago, thousands demonstrated in the ports of Tangier and other ports in Morocco to block ships carrying military material to Israel from the United States during the genocide. Despite the repression, and trade unions are playing a very important role in civil society and those grassroots movements, and BDS Morocco is leading that work despite the repression. They're succeeding to still mobilize. In Jordan, in Oman, we've succeeded, BDS groups in both countries have succeeded to shut down Carrefour completely. Carrefour is a French supermarket chain that is massive in the Arab region and across the world, and very deeply complicit in Israel's crimes against Palestinians. It has shut down completely in Jordan and Oman. There is no longer Carrefour in those two countries. In Bahrain, several branches of Carrefour have shut down. Okay, those might seem like small examples, but under extreme conditions of repression, they show the will, the resolve of organizers on the ground, and they show the potential still despite the repression. And again, like in the West, repression in the Arab region is so severe, so unprecedented, where carrying a Palestinian flag can be an offense in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. It's because they are so terrified of Palestine, of little Gaza, evoking, connecting struggles like never before, connecting the struggles for justice in those countries, for economic and social and democratic justice and so on, with the struggle for Palestinian rights. They know that when thousands of students in a Cairo university mobilize for Palestine, they will also mobilize for social and economic and political justice in Egypt. They know the connections can be terrifying to those dictatorships. So that's why the repression has been unprecedented in those countries. But still, we are organizing and we are making connections much better than before with academic associations, with trade unions, with women's groups, with youth groups, student groups across the Arab region, especially in countries where civil society is still very vivid, like in Morocco, Egypt, and elsewhere. As to your first question, And I have to be very careful because we are living under apartheid, and I can get in very serious trouble with the regime if I say the wrong words. But following Israeli analysts, we've never seen what they're seeing on TV today. Major Israeli historians are saying Gaza is not Auschwitz, but it belongs to the same family of genocide, what Israel is doing there. Major Zionist literary figures are saying we are ashamed of what Israel is doing in terms of induced starvation of millions. It reminds us of what the Germans had done to us. That's an exact, almost exact quote from a very famous literary figure in Israel. Those are unprecedented statements. This used to be an absolute taboo where you could not compare what Israel does to the Palestinians with what the Germans had done during the Holocaust. It was absolutely forbidden. Today, that has been shattered. The taboo has been shattered, not by ultra radical anti Zionist BDS supporters who are Israeli, no, but by very mainstream academics, intellectuals, even some politicians in Israel, even the leader of one so called leftist Zionist party in Israel. Okay, so going back to the question about the potential for implosion, the concern about the implosion of the settler colony, that is Israel, has reached pitch level well before the genocide, with the rise of the fascist far right to government in Israel as early as January, February 2023. And the BDS movement has analyzed that moment in an important piece of research that's on our website. We started detecting existential fears, not the the rehearsed existential fears that all Israelis repeat all the time. You know, Israelis call everything Palestinians do, including having babies, as an existential threat. I mean, we're used to that. No, but this was serious, honest, for a change, honest expression of existential fears by key figures in the Israeli establishment, in the Israeli deep state. Major economists, major academics, major security military leaders saying that Israel is not Poland, it's not Turkey, it's not Hungary, it's not a normal state that can afford to go through phases, authoritarianism or even dictatorship, and then shift back to a more democratic system. It cannot. It's a unique state that cannot afford this. It has to have a democratic, they didn't use the word facade, but that's what they meant. It needs to maintain a democratic facade to continue existing, not to thrive, to continue existing. So undermining the justice system in Israel is undermining democracy and will lead to very severe consequences. Haaretz has put it, will Israel survive to celebrate its centennial? And the answer at the end of the article was probably not. And this is Haaretz. So my point is that with the genocide, more and more Israeli figures, literary, academic, military figures, and the military are the most important in Israel, obviously, as you know, are saying for the first time in their history, they're making a comparison between what Israel is doing to indigenous Palestinians to what the Germans had done to Jews during the Holocaust. This was an absolute taboo. We couldn't even mention it. Today, leaders of Israeli parties are mentioning it. Leading historians, including historians, they're saying Gaza is not Auschwitz, but what we're doing there is within the same family of genocide. This is completely new. Starving millions of people is something that we, of all people, should never do. This is one Israeli literary figure who said this very recently. Now, this is opening an opportunity to undermine Zionist propaganda in the West, where it matters the most, because in the global South, it's not as impactful. It's not. We don't face it when we work in Latin America, Africa, Asia Pacific. We don't face this propaganda. It's only in the colonial West where it's most influential. Israel is losing even that propaganda war because of this comparison with German crimes during the Holocaust. Israel is being exposed to the whole world, not just to the global south, to the whole world as a settler colony that has entered this phase of absolute savagery. And for a settler colony to enter that means forsaking, undoing every bit of effort Israel has successfully won in building itself as a normal state. As scholars of settler colonialism would say, achieving normalcy is always the ultimate goal of any settler colony, to become a normal state, no longer looked upon as a settler colony. The US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they thrive to be normal states, that no one remembers that they are settler colonies, that the US is Turtle Island, that indigenous communities till today live under kind of apartheid rules that discriminate against them. They don't want that. They want to be normal. Well, Israel, of all settler colonies, is the absolute least normal. And with this induced genocide, induced starvation as part of its genocide, with images of skeletal Palestinian babies live streamed all over the world, it's over. There is no way for Israel to come back from this. It's irreversible. The damage done to Israel's perception, including in the colonial West, is irreversible in my view. So this fear of implosion among Israeli leading academics and military figures is very sincere for the first time.
Omar, to the effect that at this point you addressed it. Actually, I just want to make sure that in the breakup we didn't miss the momentum, and that is you and I and many others who have been like awake in the early 80s. Sorry if I'm dating you. In the early 80s and mid 80s. Since then, up to recently, it seemed like there is an impenetrable wall in the United States and Europe, or much of Europe, regarding the question of Israel because of the support. And we have never seen, as you are saying right now, we have never seen the delegitimization of the official Israeli narrative, both outside and inside Israel. It seems, even if it's limited inside Israel. How does this change the work of PACBI and what's happening in U.S. campuses or beyond in Europe and elsewhere? How does this change? Given you and I and Noura chatted as we were getting ready for the feed, and we talked about how the weaponization of all sorts of narratives, correct and fabricated, has, in terms of Israel's, Israel's narrative, Israel's raison d'être, and so on, how that actually is being shattered. The question is, to what extent is it being shattered, and to what extent will this actually produce policy? The distance is quite large, and we know that it's not immediate. But how does this change the work that's being done? And if you want to compare a little bit, even if a lot of people assume that the state of apartheid that we observe in Israel, Palestine, is similar to the state of apartheid in South Africa, and we know that the Palestinian case is much more profound, much worse actually. When people are trying to equate them, people are like, no, it's different from an Israeli perspective. Yes, it is different in the sense that it's actually much worse. It's not just about labor; it's far beyond, and so on. If you want to make the comparison, in the last years, in the run-up to the dismantlement of apartheid in South Africa, are there similar moments, and what can be done strategically, and what is being done strategically to capture this moment? And can maybe the question is, can something be done at this moment?
Do we have 6 hours for those 13 questions?
Just 3 hours, because yeah.
There are 13 questions. I counted. Okay, I'll try to very briefly answer some key factors that have changed, and it's impossible to now in a short period to cover all the factors in my perspective that have changed. But one major factor that has always been at the core of Israel's power in the West is Jewish support for Zionism and Israel. It's been taken for granted for decades. And this is the most important factor in Israel's power in the West, the most. There's so many other factors, the military industrial complex, and so on, imperial, but the most important factor in my analysis is Jewish support for Israel and Zionism, which is being shattered as we speak, especially among younger Jewish generations, especially in the United States where it matters the most. With the rise of Jewish Voice for Peace and the massive growth of its support base, we're seeing Israel, this conflation between Israel and all Jews being shattered like never before. I know things I've written 10 years ago have become much more mainstream today, and no one remembers who even mentioned them. So for example, 15 years ago, I wrote that saying attacking Israel, criticizing Israel, BDS against Israel is anti-Semitic, is an anti-Semitic statement because it equates Israel with all Jews. An attack on Israel is an attack on Jews per se. It makes this complete conflation between Israel and world Jewry. And the Zionist movement has always done that. Now, if it was problematic, toxic, possibly posing a threat to Jewish communities before the genocide, now it's existentially threatening. It's not just a problem for Jewish communities, because saying Israel and all Jews is one and the same is not just racist. It's not just reducing Jews to a monolith represented by Israel, which is extremely anti-Semitic. It's also saying the genocide is Jewish. The occupation is Jewish. Ethnic cleansing is Jewish. Starving millions of Palestinians is Jewish. They're not Jewish. There's nothing Jewish about all those. They're Israeli policies. And unless Jewish communities can successfully separate from that, they will be automatically implicated. Israel and the Zionist movement are implicating all Jews in their crimes against Palestinians. So progressive Jewish groups like JVP will go down in history as having saved Jewish communities from this extremely dangerous conflation, not just for Palestinians, first and foremost for us, obviously, but also for Jewish safety. And that is part of why I think it's irreversible. The damage to the settler colony is irreversible for several factors that I can state. This is one of the key factors. Israel has lost younger Jewish generations, and this is not recoverable. They cannot recover from that. Today's support for BDS among young Jewish Americans is massive. We've never seen as much support among Jewish Americans on campuses and everywhere else. There are other factors, of course. The main anti-BDS slogan was always about Israel is a democracy and all that garbage. Today, it's not even a bad joke. You cannot, if any academic on campus goes on a lecture and says, oh, but Israel is a democracy, they'll be laughed at. I mean, they'll be ridiculed like never before. What are you talking about? Not even for Jewish Israelis, it's no longer a real democracy. Even for the settlers, it's no longer a full democracy, let alone the indigenous population that it's massacring and genociding. So that is another dramatic change that's irreversible, I think. What's also irreversible is that Israel has for decades been loved by the entire Western colonial establishment, liberals and right-wingers and leftists and, all of them. Today, it's absolutely monopolized by the far right and the fascists. Those are the ones who love Israel. They hate the Jews and they love Israel, be it the Hungarian dictatorship, be it across Europe, fascist parties, in the Netherlands, in Germany, AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, all the fascist parties in Italy, in France, fascist parties across Europe, in the United States, Christian nationalists and all the fascist groups around them, evangelical Christian Zionists and so on, all of them are anti-Semitic to the core, yet they love Israel. Israel has become the model of securitization, of dealing with those Muslims and Arabs and those brown people that want to take our privileges away from us, be it Mexicans or God knows what. All this fascist tendency. Today, Israel is the poster boy for the world fascists. So world fascists have united around Israel today. They're protecting it from India to Hungary, from the United States to Argentina. Every fascist in the world today sees Israel as their model, and that's why they support it to the hilt, to the end. They will support it because it's us to them. It's representing our values. But those values are no longer freedom and democracy, blah blah blah, all the garbage that the liberals have tried to sell us. It's the white supremacy, exclusion, racism against brown people and black people, Muslims, and so on and so forth. That is an irreversible damage to Israel. It's no longer accepted in even liberal circles. It is really the monopoly of the far right and the fascists. So that those are some of several other factors that, in my view, are irreversible. On one of your 13 questions on South Africa and the comparison, again, a lot can be said, but I think we've always in the BDS movement made it very clear. We're inspired by the South African struggle against apartheid. We never copy paste. We have our own peculiarities, particularities, and we are very cognizant of the real issues in South Africa today, that economic apartheid is live and well. Political apartheid has ended, but economic apartheid lives on. The black majority is still deprived of the resources of their country, although they are the absolute majority of the population. And that's why in the BDS call, which is, yes, one page short, but it has a lot of meaning in the sense when we say the right of Palestinian refugees to return, and we explain that return and reparations as per UN Resolution 194, this is also to address economic justice, not just political justice. This is the absolute most important Palestinian right, the right of refugees to return and receive reparations. The absolute most important. So we are addressing this, and this is something we learned from the South African struggle. In fact, we've learned a lot from it, but we're in a completely different era. The social media era, the completely different era than South Africa. So there are many similarities and many differences. In South Africa, they never wanted to get rid of the entire black population. They wanted to exploit them. Ethnically cleanse, but exploit them. Israel once is a classic case of settler colonialism. It wants to completely eliminate the natives, not exploit them. So South Africa was the odd one out in settler colonies. Israel is the typical one. Like Turtle Island, like Australia, they want to eliminate the natives. And they were waiting for the opportunity. Now with the rise of the fascist right across the West, especially in the United States, they saw the golden opportunity that they've been waiting for since 1948. This is the chance to commit a live stream genocide and get away with it. Or so they think. Because with the demise of Western powers, they will not get away with it for too long.
Thanks, Omar. I know that these 13 questions were a lot, but this does mean that we have to talk to you, speak to you again. I'm going to relieve you because we kept you for too long. But before we break, may I put the website on the screen so people can check out PACBI? Is that all right with you?
Of course.
So here we go. So this is the PACBI website, bdsmovement.net/PACBI. Is there anything about the website you would like to mention before we close where people can connect?
Yes, I think if people look at the impact part, if they look up in the search button impact, they can go to the academic part and the impact, or just search for universities, divestment, boycott, those search words under the BDS movement. This is particularly important for the US context because, as we know, in the US, even organizers can be very US centric. The world ends between New York and California. There is no other, maybe London. It's very, very important to see what's happening across the world. universities from Barcelona to Amsterdam to Oslo to Trinity College in Dublin to South Africa. I mean, it's really important for campus organizers, or academic workers, as well as students organizers, to see what's happening across the world, because there are so many absolutely inspiring examples. I mentioned one of them, the strike at University of Amsterdam. There's so many others that people can be inspired. The trade unions, what they did at Trinity College Dublin, is just a classic case of how academics, trade unions, and students can work together to achieve what was considered unachievable in the most prestigious college in Ireland. So there's so many examples there that people can look at, and I can send you the link later, Bassam.
Yes, I tried to scroll through. So people
I'll
can.
send you the specific one about universities. I'll
Sure,
send it. It's yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Shukran, Omar. Thank you very much for your generosity, and I'd like to thank also our new co-host for this particular episode, Noura, for joining us and enriching the discussion. Let me go back to our other view. Noura and Omar, if you'd like to have any last words, please feel free. But Omar, I would like us to speak with you again on very specific issues that are not part of the academic freedom or the In Defense of Academic Freedom series. Any last words, Noura?
يعطيك العافية عمر. Thank you. We're living through I think the worst moment of Palestinian history, and I can only, we just keep pushing, we keep doing, we keep speaking when words have felt so futile, and keep organizing to end the genocide and to dismantle Zionism completely and usher Palestinian liberation.
Yes, there's nothing to add except we need to hold on to hope, but realistic hope, because we cannot allow them to colonize our minds, as I mentioned, with hopelessness. Although the moment might seem so enraging, so unspeakable, we need to see that we are achieving something. Actually, it's not, we're not imagining. We do see indicators of very, very dramatic change. They will never give us the luxury of admitting our impact, so it's upon us to always search for the impact, amplify the impact, and hold on to hope, realistic hope, because that is a key to liberation.
Thanks. With this, Omar and Noura and everyone watching, we will conclude, and we hope to speak with you under better circumstances. Shukran, Omar.
Shukran. Bye.
Salam.